Thank you for inviting me to do this. Hats off to Citrus Heights Water District for doing these classes. So my name's Kevin Marini, and I am somebody that has been teaching composting for a very, very long time, 25 years, all different ages. Started with kids with worms and taught adults over the last 20 years managing the UC Master Gardener programs up in Placer and Nevada counties. I did that for 20 years. Worked in a little bit of defensible space outreach right now with UC, but I started my own business 3 years ago after I passed the baton for the Master Gardener program. And so I do a lot of, I'm a certified arborist, so I do tree evaluations, and I also do fine pruning because that's a niche in our yard maintenance world that is unfilled at this point. So it's a wonderful thing to be doing. So I like to say that I suffer from OCD, obsessive composting disorder. Okay, so if I could have you for 3 hours, I could fill 3 hours, easy, talking about composting. You're probably going, no way. So the Master Gardener training classes, when they're trained on these different topics, are 3 hours long, and I've always taught the composting one up and down the state. So trust me, I have to really condense this all the composting info I can share with you into, boom, this presentation, about 45 minutes, okay? So hang on, get ready, we're going for a compost ride, and then at the end you'll have a chance to ask questions. Sound good? Okay, so it's kind of cliche to say this, but the reality is composting is all about turning something that we look at as waste and looking at it differently as a resource. Right? So usually when you have organic materials in your yard or you're producing a bunch of food scraps in your kitchen, you're thinking, how do I get rid of this waste? And what I've tried to do over all these years is change the consciousness around that material and look at that material as a resource for you to turn into something really amazing, compost, that you can then use in your yard. So instead of just discarding that stuff, how can we use it and turn it into something that would benefit us as gardeners? Or even if you're not a gardener, if you just have a yard, it can be beneficial. So that's kind of why I say composting for soil health while turning waste into a resource. Okay, so why compost at all? You know, I will actually start with pure astonishment, the wow factor, because if you've ever taken a bunch of yard waste and food scraps and turned it into garden gold, compost, that transformation is pretty amazing, okay? Especially the volume, right? So you can have this huge pile of organic materials and decrease that down to a couple wheelbarrows full of good quality compost. So it's an amazing thing to experience, and if you haven't done it, I highly recommend giving compost a try. So there is just that wow factor, and if you're a gardener, you're really focused on the soil health benefits. So whether you're growing in native soil, real soil, or you're growing in purchased media, okay, so whatever you buy in a bag is not soil. Soil can't be bought in a bag. So this stuff that you buy in bags that people grow in is organic matter, right? So when you look at real soil, we have this stuff that comes from rock. Real soil comes from rock. That's why it's full of minerals. So you have all these minerals, sand, silt, and clay in different proportions. You have air, you have water, and then you have a little tiny pie slice of what's called organic matter, which is just like biomass, right? And so in our native soils, that pie slice is, it says 5%, but no, probably not. More like 2-3%. It's a tiny little pie slice. And so when you're gardening in your yard in real soil, you want to take that pie slice and make it bigger. Get it up to 5, 8, 10%. Okay? So compost, when you make compost, you contribute to your soil's health by adding organic matter to real soil and increasing that pie slice. Does that make sense? If you're buying stuff in bags and growing plants in the bag stuff, that's all organic matter. So the pie slice is like the whole thing, Okay, of course there's a little bit of air in there, but there's very little minerals in bagged products, right? So I always recommend that people add a little native soil to their raised beds or add some sort of mineral supplement to have mineral-rich vegetables, right? So in this case, because it's all organic matter, it cycles super fast. And so you have to replenish, replenish, replenish. If you've ever had a raised bed and noticed that the level shrinks, right, pretty quickly every year, that's that organic matter getting used up super fast. So it doesn't matter if you're gardening in the ground or you're gardening in containers, compost is going to help you keep your soil healthy. Okay? I know that this is commonly called soil, so I'll just refer to it as soil, even though now you know this is actual soil and this is all organic matter. Okay? Okay, finally, environmental impact. When we take organic materials and we compost them at home, we keep them from potentially getting into a landfill situation, right? We are able to produce a product right there on site, so we also avoid the trucking and hauling of all these materials. So ideally, we want to be composting what we produce in our yards and in our homes on site. That's ideal. Can everyone do that? No. But if you can, that's a great goal to shoot for, okay? So let's talk about a larger environmental impact. This is a graph showing about, 60 years of municipal solid waste management in California. And what it kind of shows is that all these years, the landfill amounts have remained relatively the same, even though we have increased recycling, increased composting, and used some of that organic material for energy. And so what that means is we have a lot, even though we do great job in California, in general, composting our organic materials in municipal compost situations, there's still a challenge in front of us to decrease that landfill space. And so the more that we compost, the more that landfill space can be for other garbage and last a lot longer. Does that make sense? Good. Now finally, and this is in relationship to your water district here, when you take compost and you add it to soil, whether you're using the bag products or in-ground gardening, you increase that soil's ability to hold water, but hold it in a way that maintains oxygen. So compost has this magical ability to not only hold on to water, but maintain air in its particles, right? So when you add compost to soil, you're actually increasing that soil's ability to hold on to water and allow it to give it to plant in a more efficient way. So again, this is not just about soil health in the sense of like nutrients, it's also about water holding capacity and keeping air in the soil. So on all these different fronts, hopefully, that's convinced you that this is a good thing to try. And of course, don't forget that wow factor. Especially if you have young ones, they love composting because there's always a bunch of critters in a compost pile, right? So the University of California is really good at making super technical definitions of things. So I thought I'd share their definition of compost. Compost is the biologically active material that results from microbial decomposition of organic matter under controlled conditions. The key is that compost just happens. So don't worry about that technical definition. Just keep in your mind, compost happens. Decomposition happens. It's happening right now outside. Wherever there's soil outside, decomposition is happening. Composting is where human beings get involved and control the conditions. So decomposition happens with or without us, right? But composting is us getting involved, controlling conditions to make the decomposition process happen faster in most cases, okay? So don't worry about that technical definition so much. Just keep in your mind that this is something you can do because it happens. Whether, it might happen really slow in nature, but we can get involved, control some conditions, and make it go faster. Okay. So a compost pile is a whole ecosystem, okay? So you put all these organic materials together, and what happens, you get this whole entire food web of critters that get involved to break down those organic materials into what's called stable humus over time. So humus, not hummus, right? So hummus has two M's. Humus 1. Humus is a stable organic matter particle in the soil. When you have a compost pile like this, and you want that raw material to turn into stable humus, that takes a very, very long time, longer than we're going to be alive on the earth. But in the middle, we create compost, which then continues to break down in the soil with the soil organisms into humus over time. So we kind of come in, take those raw materials, break them down to compost, add them to the soil, and then over a long period of time, that becomes a stable particle in the soil, improving it sustainably throughout time. So even though we can't necessarily create humus immediately in our backyards, it will be created over time wherever you apply the compost. And so there's a whole bunch of drama going on in here. There's, all sorts of organisms that are eating each other. There's a lot of, reproduction going on. There's a lot of drama. Think about the craziest, dramatic thriller movie that you've ever seen, and I guarantee you there's way more drama and thrilling, murder going on in a compost pile, believe it or not, because all these organisms feed off each other, okay? And we need all of them to break down this material efficiently. So, in general, there's two buckets of types of organic material. So in the literature, you're going to read about browns and greens. How many people have ever heard of that? Okay, good. So believe it or not, even though this is going to sound so simple when I present it, a lot of people get hung up on which bucket materials belong into. And that, I think, has to do with the darn color of the material and the reference point being browns versus greens. So for example, cow manure is colored brown, but it doesn't belong in the browns, right? That's an example of what I'm talking about. So you can't go by color of material, okay? So what are browns? They're carbon materials that are completely dried out, very, very low moisture content, and it's things that have been dead for a while. Right? So they've not only lost their moisture, they've lost their nitrogen, the part that keeps them green, if you will, right? So what falls into the carbon or brown category? Well, dried leaves, straw, sawdust from dried out wood, wood chips that are dried out from, if you have a green tree and you chip up the wood chips, that's still full of water and nitrogen, right? So wood chips that are dried out and don't have nitrogen anymore. All those plants in your yard that are dead and they're brown, that's all brown material. And the things that aren't included on this slide are things like newspaper and cardboard, okay? That would also be in this brown category. So in general, as I talk about composting, you're always going to want both browns and greens. Okay, we'll get to the greens in a second. So if you needed browns and you didn't have any, where could you go get them for free? What did you say?
Where you get the chips.
Wood chips, right? So tree companies will gladly come to your home and dump a bunch of wood chips on your driveway. There's actually a website called chipdrop.com, and you can sign up, and when tree companies are in the area, they look up who's on Chip Drop, and they come and drop 15 yards of wood chips in your driveway. So be ready for it. You could also go buy a bale of straw. That would last a long time to help form compost piles. You could go dumpster dive for newspaper and cardboard, right? So if you need browns, you can find them. You could go around your neighborhood in the fall and rake leaves from your neighbor's lawns, right? And collect them and hold them. But you need browns to compost. Yes?
What about, so with newspapers, what about the ink and
It's basically all soy-based ink now with newspapers, so you don't have to worry about that. There is a general recommendation to avoid a lot of glossy type paper that has varnishes on it, like the ads and things like that. But as far as the newsprint itself, whether it's black and white or color, it's all soy-based ink and totally fine for compost.
And what about envelopes and, your mail?
So, we could go down a little bit of a rabbit hole there, because you could make the argument that the glues on cardboards are an issue and the glues on envelopes.
and tape and stuff like that?
So, there's definitely some issue with that, but as far as the composting process, it will break it down.
Awesome.
Yeah, okay. So, first thing first, now you know what browns are, right? Now let's go to greens. These are materials that still have moisture. They still have nitrogen in them, okay? So this stuff may have, come off a plant recently, but it's not, quote, dead in the sense that it's been sitting around, drying out, losing its water, losing its nitrogen. And so this is where some of the tricky stuff comes, because there's brown stuff that fall into the green category, like coffee grounds. Right? Colored brown, but they're full of nitrogen still. Even actually after we make coffee from them, there's still a decent amount of nitrogen in grounds. And then, of course, animal manures, which are colored brown, but as fresh manure is full of nitrogen, it would fall into the green category. So you can't go by color, go by moisture content and nitrogen content, and how, long the thing has been sitting there dead, basically, because browns, like I said, have been dead for quite a while, greens not so much. So what falls into this category besides coffee grounds and animal manures? Well, all our vegetable and fruit scraps, right? So you may have a little container under your sink or on your counter to collect those trimmings and things. Those would be green materials. And then, of course, if you're mowing your lawn, all those fresh grass clippings would be green materials, right? And so no matter how you're doing a backyard compost pile, whether you're doing a hot pile or a cold pile, which I'm going to talk about in a second, you need both browns and greens. The number one thing that I have seen that's the big problem for composting over 20 plus years is that most people only have greens. They take that little compost crock and they fill it up with food scraps and they go out and they dump it in a compost bin over and over and over and over. And when you have a pile that's just greens, you get yucky smells, anaerobic conditions, you get major fly issues, right? No one wants to go out and see maggots in the compost pile, right? And you get very, very slow decomposition. So the organisms that break down organic materials need both the carbon in the browns and the nitrogen in the greens to populate the pile and break things down fast. So you have to have both. When you take that compost container out and you dump it, you cover it with an equal volume of browns. Okay? So I always use 5-gallon buckets as the visual, right? So 5-gallon bucket full of greens is going to be dense and heavy, right? Because everything's filled with water. Imagine a 5-gallon bucket filled with food scraps, fruit and vegetable scraps. Really heavy, full of moisture. How about the 5-gallon bucket full of browns? Light, pretty darn light, right? It's all dried out stuff. But to have equal volumes, you have to stuff that brown bucket full, right? Because if you just filled it up with leaves, there's a bunch of air in there. So really to have equal volumes, which is what you want to always have when you're building a compost pile, whether it's cold or hot, you got to have a lot of browns, okay? That's the part that people usually ignore. It's usually just pile and pile and piles of greens. Okay, so that right there, that information may change your whole composting life if you've ever been challenged making good compost. Okay, so we've talked about browns and greens. Let's talk about how to utilize the browns and greens in a backyard compost pile or some of these other methods. So you probably have heard of hot composting, hopefully, That is this idea that if you mix greens and browns together in an adequate volume, 3 by 3 by 3 at least, but it can be as big as however you want, it starts to create heat and break things down super fast. The benefit of hot composting is that you take a lot of raw materials and turn them into finished compost fast. So it's speed, why you would want to do hot composting. The other reason you might want to do hot composting is if you're dealing with a lot of weed seeds or diseased plants and you don't want those seeds to be in your finished compost, you don't want those diseases to be in your finished compost, the heat is what breaks down those weed seeds and what breaks down those plant diseases. So really hot composting is all about speed and quality, okay? But overwhelmingly in my career, 90% of people do not do hot composting. They generally do cold composting. And that has to do with the amount of volume of materials you have at any one moment, right? So you need a lot of greens and a lot of browns to build a pile that's big enough to make heat, right? Most people just create compost as materials become available, and it's just a cold compost. So I'm going to talk about both now, and we'll distinguish between the two. But before I do that, what is your goal? That is how you determine what compost system is going to work best for you. So if you're I'm a four-season vegetable gardener. I got 26 fruit trees. I need a lot of compost all the time. So I will actually do hot composting because I have 7 acres. I have a ton of material. I can turn it into compost fast, and I can use it. So that's my goal. But your goal might be, I just want to recycle the stuff I produce. I don't even care about producing a ton of compost. I just want to recycle this stuff on site. So maybe a different system would work better for you. That's less work, right? So think about your goal. You know, a family of 4 is going to produce a lot more fruit and vegetable scraps than one person living by themselves. So, you know, the volume of material you have to deal with is a big factor in this equation, okay? All right, so let's start with hot composting. You know, this is the way that composting is done in large-scale situations. So if you drove over to Roseville to our dump, also called the Material Recovery Facility, you will see football field length compost windrows that are steaming just like that. So they can be huge, but at a minimum, it has to be at least 3 by 3 by 3 to host enough organisms that can actually start creating heat. And this is the weird thing about hot composting. The heat is created from within. So you could be in Alaska in -30 and have a hot compost pile. The ambient temperature it impacts it a little bit, of course, but the heat is actually produced from within, from the population of organisms, okay? So you need a large volume of organic materials to build this pile because you're treating it as a batch. You're building it, and then you're decomposing it, and you're finishing it off, okay? Versus what most people do is add to a compost pile all the time as materials become available. So this is a different type of composting, okay? And so the biggest issue with hot composting is keeping it aerobic, keeping air in it. Because as the pile collapses on itself and breaks down, you start pushing out air, and the organisms are using oxygen. And so you've probably heard of turning your compost pile, right? That's why with hot composting, if you don't go out there once a week or once every couple weeks and turn it and bring air into it, it stalls out, it stops decomposing, and the organisms die off. So turning your pile, the UC Master Gardener program, we had a little mantra, which was equal volumes of greens and browns, like I mentioned with the 5-gallon buckets, and then turn it once a week, keep it moist like a wrung out sponge, and over about an 8-week period, if you do that, you can turn a big pile into finished compost. So that's kind of one way that you can compost for speed, right? My guess is the majority of you here will probably not be doing hot composting because, again, you'd have to have a pretty good volume of materials. But it's good to know what this is all about so you don't get confused with these other methods. Now, let's move on to cold composting. Like I said, this is what most people are doing in their backyard. In fact, in my experience, people will go out and buy a bin before they ever compost. Okay, I don't suggest that. I suggest getting an idea of how much material you have. It may be that you don't even need a compost bin. You don't need to have some sort of receptacle. It's nice to keep it tidy, to keep critters out, right? And you can get some nice aesthetically pleasing bins nowadays. So I'm not saying don't get one, but it's not necessary to actually do composting. So in most cases with cold composting, you have some sort of area where you're dumping this stuff, and you have to really, really avoid the temptation to do something I call dump and run, okay? And that has to do with that compost collection thing you have on your counter or under your sink, and people will go out because it starts getting nasty, starts to smell in the kitchen, flies and gnats start flying around, and so you go out and you dump it and then you run away. Right? And so you can't do that, okay? That is a recipe for disaster with composting because it leads to a pile of yuck, flies, all that stuff. So you have to dump and then get some browns, get some leaves, get some straw, get some sawdust, something to equalize those greens out with browns, okay? Even in a cold composting system. So in general, in cold composting, as you put more and more stuff on top, the compost gets formed on the bottom, right? And so at some point, you're like, okay, I keep adding to this pile, but I actually want to get some compost. How do I get it? Well, if you've noticed, a lot of compost bins have a little door on the bottom. And that little door allows you to open up, get your little trowel, stick it in there, and get a little bit of compost if you need it. So cold composting works over long periods of time. It does deliver compost, but it delivers a small amount all the time versus hot composting. You can actually get a batch, a half yard of compost at one time. Okay, does that make sense? Good. So nothing against cold composting. Totally fine to do. Just realize this isn't the most efficient way to produce the most compost. It's a good way to recycle organic materials, especially if you don't have a lot to recycle. So the biggest issue with this is moisture, because a lot of times as you're adding on top, you're not paying attention to the overall moisture of the pile. When you turn a hot compost pile, you really pay attention to the moisture. But in this case, you're not seeing a lot of the pile mostly. So it's always good to make sure you add a little bit of water, especially in our summers. A dried out compost pile is a home for a critter, okay? So if you make a pile of stuff and it dries out, some critter is gonna move in there and say, thanks for making this home for me. That may be rats, that may be, possums, that may be mice, that may be, in my area, rattlesnakes, right? So you never know, if you make a brush pile and it's all dry, critters will move in. So you've got to keep it moist when you're doing these cold composting piles. Okay, moving on. Worm composting is something that I have been teaching for a very long time because I started teaching composting to kids, and there's magic that happens when you bring worms into a first grade classroom, trust me. At first they're like, ew, the worm guy's here, gross. And then like 10 minutes later, they're naming their worms and they're like, I'm never letting Roxanne go, And so the transformation is so fast that if you work with youth in any way and want to blow their minds, bring worms around. They're amazing, okay? But the problem with worm composting is that it's really hard to process a lot of material, right? So for me, 7 acres, right, all this garden stuff, all this yard waste, I can't process it all through worms. It's too hard. And so I use my backyard compost piles for just my yard waste, okay? And then I put all my food scraps through a worm bin system. Because I live in the country, and if I had all my food scraps out in my backyard compost piles, I would have visitors, a lot of visitors. And so to keep that food separate from my yard waste, which doesn't attract bears, right? I use worms for my food scraps. And so the original systems of worm bins were these DIY Rubbermaid or plastic bins that were converted into like worm homes, okay? And you take them and you put some holes in them for air. You use shredded paper as bedding material. You put these specialized red worms, red wigglers are specific composting worms that you use. You don't dig out worms from your backyard and put them in a worm bin. You buy red wigglers, which are specific worms that eat a lot of stuff and break down organic food scraps very quickly. And so the early systems were kind of DIY systems that worked okay, but you ended up with this situation where at some point you had to dump out the whole bin and separate the castings, the worm poop, the good stuff, worm compost, from the actual worms, right? So that system is tricky with that. So then they developed these other systems that were based on multiple levels. So there's lots of names for this. The can of worms was a popular one. The vermi hut, the worm condo, all these different ones were brought to market. And in this idea, you start down here with bedding, like shredded paper that's moistened. You put those red wigglers in. The red wigglers then devour the food scraps you give to them. And as their compost or poop accumulates, down here, you start with new bedding here and food here, and then they move up. And then you can harvest this entire tray of castings without ever having to separate the castings from the worms. How do you think that worked? You're shaking your head, and that's the right. So it's not that you can't have success with these systems. You can. But it is not necessarily true that it's so simple. It's very, very common to have worms in all these levels, no matter what. Okay, so you're probably going to have to do some separation of worms and compost. So the newest version of worm bins is the most efficient and the best. And these are called, kind of a weird name, worm bags. Okay, so this is called the urban worm bag or something like that. And there's lots of different ones, so you don't have to, focus in on this one specifically. But the point is with these, they're really nice because I have 2 of these underneath my house, okay? And so I'll take my food scraps, go down under my house, unzip the top of this worm bag, flip the top open, dump my food scraps in, zip it up, and I'm done, okay? And over time, you put the food up here, and the worms, the castings, the poop, fall down to the bottom. And there's this little area here that has a little cinch and a little buckle, and you unbuckle and uncinch, and the castings come out the bottom without any worms. So the worms are able to stay in the middle portion of the bag. The food scraps are on top, and the castings go to the bottom. So this is called a flow-through system, meaning that you never get to the point where you have to separate the castings from the worms. So it's not that you can't have success with all of these, but nowadays this is the one that's most recommended for the easiest way to use worms to recycle the food scraps. Quick question.
Under the house because?
Under the house because worms in any system cannot be in sunlight. Direct sun heats up these systems so fast that it cooks the worms, and you'll have mass worm death. And we don't want that. So basically, the thing about worm bins are that you create them with to mimic the worm situation in nature. So in nature, the worms live in what's called the duff layer. Like if you walk out into the forest, you kind of feel that spongy layer. It's all that duff before you get down to the soil, all the forest litter. That's where these red wigglers live. They're not earth-dwelling worms like our big night crawlers. These are voracious decomposers, right? So that's why you purchase them. And believe it or not, there's worm farms dotted all throughout California that you can buy them from. Even Green Acres, I think, sells red wigglers now. And so you're using those worms to eat the food scraps that you feed them, and their resulting poop have a special name, worm castings, and there's no better soil amendment on the face of the earth. I'll say that again. There's no better soil amendment that you could put in your soil or in your garden for your plants than worm poop. Okay? Worms evolved with plants, and so there's things in worm castings that, for example, there's plant growth hormones like auxin in worm poop. Why would that be? Well, because they've co-evolved, okay? So if you want the absolute best soil amendment on the face of the earth, you want worm castings. And if you go down to the nursery to buy them, a 1 cubic foot bag is pretty pricey, right? A lot more than potting soil, okay? A lot more than compost. And so you can produce a really great amendment really simply with these different systems, especially as you get more experience with them. So again, I'm trying to cover a lot of different things, so I'm not going to dive too much deeper into worm composting, but no, I just scratched the surface. There's a lot more information on that, but these are the 3 general systems that you'd want to choose from. Okay, moving on. How many people have heard of bokashi composting? This comes from Japan, and there was a Japanese scientist that discovered that there was a certain mix of microorganisms that, when applied to food scraps, eat those food scraps extremely efficiently, okay? And so they're called EM, effective microorganisms. It's a trademarked thing, okay? So you can look this up. And so bokashi is the idea that you have this bucket, say under your sink, right? And you can throw all your food scraps in it. So one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that backyard composting, whether you're hot or cold composting, and worm composting, all deal with things that come from plants or animal manures. But generally, you don't put meat in your backyard compost piles. You don't feed meat to worms. You don't put dairy products, right, in those systems. So bokashi became popular because you can put all of your food scraps. You can scrape your plate into the bokashi system, okay? And then you have to purchase, if you buy a bokashi system, it comes with a decent amount to begin with, but eventually you have to purchase more of these effective microorganisms that come in this little bag on bran. And so you fill this bucket up with your food scraps, you pour this bran over it, and the organisms break that stuff down. But the problem, the myth about bokashi is that it's a composting system when it really isn't. It doesn't actually produce a finished product that is compost. It produces a finished product that is broken down in volume and kind of looks like coffee grounds, but then you take that and you throw it in your compost pile, or you dig a hole and bury it in the soil and let it break down more, okay? So the idea that bokashi creates compost like your backyard pile, like your worm bin system, is not true. It's a different product that isn't really compost. However, how convenient to be able to take everything off your plate, scrape it into a bucket, throw some bran on it, and have it break down pretty quickly, right? So this has got popular because of that, because you could put meat bones in there. You could put chicken bones in there. You could put moldy cheese in there. It's unbelievable that this mix of organisms break down this wide range of material. Yeah. Now, the bones do take longer. But in general, bokashi, as you can imagine, is popular because of its convenience, the fact you could have it under your sink and things like that. These aren't that expensive, but remember, you're kind of tethered to always having to purchase that product to keep it going. Whereas composting, obviously, your cost is minimal, if any. You can just build a pile. So there is a cost associated with this. Okay, moving on. I want to talk about trench composting because this was the way that people disposed of organic materials, especially their food scraps, for who knows how long, thousands upon thousands of years, okay? So my grandfather, for example, actually in his garden area would take fruit and vegetable scraps, dig a trench, and bury it in there, cover it up, and then the next year in the spring, he would plant in those areas that he deposited the stuff 6 months before. It would have broken down in about a 6-month period, right? So this is, a lot of people ask me about this, but the reality is we are in a different time, right? If everybody in Citrus Heights buried their organic materials in their backyard, it could potentially lead to a groundwater issue, right? With nitrogen filtering down into our aquifers. So Citrus Heights Water District would probably not want everybody to do trench composting. However, doing it in a minimal fashion in certain circumstances is totally fine. For example, you're going to plant an orange tree in the corner of your yard and the soil is really bad there. So you dig a hole, you put some fruit and vegetable scraps in there, you put some straw on top, you put some mulch on top, and you let it sit and improve that soil over 4 to 6 months. Yes, a lot of time is needed because it's in soil, right? And so you can create, a little bit of soil fertility in place by doing this method. But the main thing to understand is that we have actual laws against burying garbage, okay? So that if somebody, your neighbor, saw you doing this, they might report you as somebody burying your garbage, even though you're just doing a little bit of trench composting. But like I said, in small amounts, this is not considered burying garbage, right? So if you did it throughout your whole backyard, that probably would be considered that. Now, the other thing about trench composting, of course, is critters, right? If you have stuff decomposing in the soil, you'll likely have something come and explore it, like a raccoon, right? Or if you have chickens, they're going to get in there and they're going to dig around like crazy, okay? So trench composting is something you read about online, you hear people talk about, but really should only be done in a minimal fashion. So what does not go in your backyard compost piles and in general all sorts of composting systems besides the bokashi thing? Well, disease-infected plants, plants with severe insects all over them, plants that propagate from pieces of themselves, right? So if you have a cold compost pile and you put a bunch of ivy in there that you've just cut, it will root and grow, right? Bermuda grass. Don't you dare put that in a compost pile. It will dominate it. So there's certain plants that you want to avoid putting in a pile. Cat and dog manures in general aren't recommended for backyard compost piles because they don't necessarily eat their natural diet, and so they can have some parasitic issues which can transfer into their poop. So we got to be careful about that. And meat and fish scraps will attract rodents and other critters. Wood ash doesn't break down well in a compost pile. It actually can actually inhibit decomposition. So these are the types of things to avoid in those backyard compost piles, whether they're hot or cold, okay? Now, using finished compost, you can do it. You can, in an annual bed where you're growing annual vegetables, you incorporate some of that compost into the soil so that it's there for those annuals to take advantage of in their short little life in the soil. For perennials, trees, shrubs, all you have to do is top dress. You don't have to dig it in. So adding an inch or two of compost around on the top around perennial type plants, it will find its way down through water and microbial action and worm action. In container mixes, you can add a little bit of compost to that potting soil to help make it a little bit richer, okay? Because a lot of potting soil is vermiculite, perlite, and peat, which are inert. And so adding some compost in there helps with the fertility. Propagation mixes, this has to do with the idea that growing seeds and growing cuttings can be benefited by having a little bit of compost in the mix. It used to be thought that those mixes needed to be sterile so that there's no bacteria or fungi that can impact the growing seedling. But now more research is showing that adding some compost in those mixes leads to more vigorous seedlings. And finally, you've probably heard of compost tea, compost extracts. This is the idea of taking a small amount of compost, because maybe that's all you produced in your backyard, but extending the benefits by mixing it with water and using that as a soil drench or foliar spray on your plants. So all these different ways are ways you can use compost. And even if you don't have a yard, you can make compost and give it away and make people happy. So that was the quickest version of composting I've ever taught. I hope that you gleaned some good messaging throughout. The number one thing I don't want you to forget is composting in your backyard involves greens and browns, always. So don't forget that if you have any type of backyard compost pile, it will change the way that you experience composting. So we have 10 minutes maybe for questions.
Yeah. When you refer to the backyard piles, does that include like worm composting? Need to be blended the same?
So in general with worms, they are operating in a different system than your backyard compost pile. When you build a backyard compost pile, native worms will come visit, okay? But worm composting is using a very specific type of worm, a red wiggler. They're from Europe. They're non-native to the States, okay? And so we use that worm because it can survive in real huge temperature swings. It can eat a bunch of our food scraps. It's just a real efficient composting worm. And in that case, you're creating bedding using browns, and you're feeding the greens to the worms on top. But you're not mixing it all together like you would in your backyard compost pile. Make sense? Yes?
Temperature for the worms, I heard no direct sunlight.
Yep.
But if the only, like, what if I keep that, whatever system for worms in the garage, and it gets so hot?
So that's the issue with the worm. So you know the plastic bins? If that in the sun for 20 minutes, worms are dead. I mean, that heats up so fast, right? And so the plastic multi-level ones also cannot be in any sun. The bags are made of Gore-Tex, which is why they're so expensive. They're over $100, but they're extremely durable. I've had my worm bags underneath my house for 6-7 years now, and they still look brand new. And I've harvested them and harvested them and harvested them. And so they can handle a little bit, but still my rule of thumb is no direct sunlight on the worm bin system.
It's the question of the heat.
So they can actually survive. I've had a worm bin under a foot of snow, took off the snow, opened up the top, and the worms were fine. I've also had a worm bin in 105-degree heat, not direct sun, but just that heat.
Yes.
And what usually happens is their appetite and activity slows. So they don't process as much in the super hot times and the super cold times, but they live. That's why we choose these worms, because they're survivors.
So I could have that bin in the garage as long as there's no direct
sun.
But it gets
And
so hot.
and you have moisture, right? You can't let it dry out.
Okay.
So with moisture, no direct sunlight, they can survive in your garage.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's the key
I
I
know.
was looking for.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I have one of those rectangular bins in
Yeah.
my backyard, and you know, with the door on the
Yeah.
bottom. Okay, if you use this system correctly and you've got the right balance,
Yeah.
how soon will that turn into compost at the very end?
So that is a super common question. How fast can I get compost? Remember, hot composting, let's set that aside, because that's not what you're talking about, right? You're talking about adding stuff all the time. So the compost that forms when you keep adding raw materials in the top is at the bottom. And within about 1 month's time, you could probably open that little door and get some compost out. And then at that point, once you've got a system that's perpetual, right? So you're continuing to add on the top, you can always kind of open that door and get a little bit of compost. The ultimate issue is if you want a lot of compost, You're just not going to produce it at one time in that system.
Okay, now that I've got that system, I noticed that when I do take compost out, there's a lot of things that have not turned into compost.
Okay.
There could be wood chips and things like that.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about getting a sifter, a soil sifter.
Great question. And so I always recommend before you put compost mixed into soil, right? So remember I said you can incorporate compost in a bed for like annual vegetables or something, right? So whenever you put compost in the soil, it has to be fully broken down. So you sift out all the stuff that's undecomposed and throw it back on the top of your pile. You want that compost, if you're putting it in the soil, to be totally decomposed. If you're just top dressing on the top around a tree or something, you can leave the coarse material because it kind of acts like a mulch, okay? But you don't want that to be incorporated into the soil because that causes issues with nitrogen, basically.
So I'm having a problem finding an adequate soil sifter. What I've been doing is putting it in one of those 5-gallon buckets, you know? So I've got this little piece of metal that I found, and it's got a grid on it.
Yeah.
So I've been doing it all manually by hand, but so I looked online to see, what's available, and I thought, it was amazing to me that some of them were made out of plastic, and I thought, okay, that's not gonna last. The grid part was made out of plastic. Do you recommend anything in particular?
So if you go down to the hardware store, you can buy a product called hardware cloth. I know that's a weird name, but it's basically like steel mesh. A lot of people line the bottom of their raised beds with hardware cloth. So chicken wire, right? Everyone kind of knows chicken wire, right? Chicken wire is 1 inch diameter. Gopher wire, which is a product just like chicken wire, but it has smaller openings, 3/4 for the bottom of raised beds, right, to keep gophers out. Then you have hardware cloth, which goes down to 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch. And so you can use hardware cloth, 1/2 inch, attached to a little 2x4 frame. So what I did was I built a frame that sits exactly on my wheelbarrow. And then I put hardware cloth. So now I just take my compost, put it on that, shake it a few times. The good stuff falls into the wheelbarrow. The rest goes back into the compost. You can make your own. They do sell them, though, online as well. You can buy compost sifters online. Go, check Amazon. Yes.
How big should you, if you're going to use that? I've got some chicken wire, but I've got this more of the. How big should the hole be?
Well, you can use any of those materials to sift.
Well, you don't want to use 1 inch.
But
1/2 inch would be better. 1/4 inch would be best.
I think so. Because
so 1/2 inch or 1/4?
I would go with 1/2. 1/4 inch gets a little frustrating because there's some big pieces that maybe should go through that don't. I like 1/2 inch. That's the sweet spot for me.
And then anything that's too big just goes on put on top of your. So I got a plant. I've got a one just like hers.
Back into the compost pile or on top of an area with mulch. Yeah. Okay, Jace, go for it.
I know there are in-ground worm cast systems.
Yes. The sub pod was the famous one. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on those?
So what he's referring to are these bins that get placed into a garden bed. You put worms in there, just like a worm composting system, but it's living in a garden bed. And the idea is that the worms are going to poop. Their castings are going to then go right into your garden bed, number one, and so you can move this system around to replenish certain areas of your yard garden. And if there's any crazy environmental conditions that are bad for the worms, they can go down and kind of escape. So that's kind of the marketing of these types of systems. I personally do not recommend those systems. And the reason why is because those are non-native worms, right? And so do we really want to release non-native worms, en masse in all of our yards and gardens? My guess is they would quickly outcompete our native worms and not necessarily cause problems, but who knows, right? So I don't love those. I'd rather have the worm system separate, harvest the castings, and use the castings in the garden. Yeah. Go ahead.
What about coffee grounds? I just dump them into my yard. So I should dump them into my composter instead?
Yep. So in general, right, so UC Master Gardener program has kind of these rules of thumb, best practices, if you will. And one of the best practices is compost everything and apply the finished compost to your yards. So a lot of people will take rice hulls or coffee ground or even, their chicken manure coop clean out stuff and just throw it in their soil or throw it in their garden. And what we've always recommended is compost that stuff and the finished compost put into your soil. Because when you add a bunch of organic materials that aren't decomposed to soil, weird stuff happens. There's nutrient tie-up. Like you can have a plant that grows very, very poorly because you have put coffee grounds all around it and the organisms are trying to break down the coffee grounds rather than help grow the plant. That's the best way to explain it. Yeah. So we always say compost it, compost it, compost it. Coffee grounds is the one material obviously you can kind of get away with, top dressing around stuff. And if you go to Starbucks, you'll see outside how they just dump it outside around the plants that are outside, right? And they're not dying, but they're not thriving. So I always suggest composting that stuff. Any other questions? Thank you for listening and coming.